The ocean roars around the ship, waves crashing against the hull as sailors clutch their stations amid howling winds and pouring rain. Every creak of the wood, every spray of salty spray reminds them survival depends on relentless effort and gritty ingenuity. On these perilous voyages of the 16th century, keeping the ship watertight was an unforgiving battle, using thick pitch smeared over every seam, boiling tar poured into cracks, and wooden planks carefully layered and sealed with iron nails. These brave men faced storms that threatened to tear them apart, risking their lives to push beyond uncharted horizons. Their stories echo of resilience, suffering and courage, the human spirit tested by the vast savage sea. If you're fascinated by these daring adventures, subscribe now to reach 3,000 explorers. Tell us where you're watching from and drop an emoji to show you're on board for this epic voyage through maritime history. You can imagine how it feels to stand on the deck of a 16th century galleon with the icy wind slicing through your soaked clothes. The salty spray hits your face like tiny shards of glass, and the wooden planks beneath your feet are slick with rain and seawater. The ship creaks and groans, every swell making her sway violently. Now picture that day after day, month after month, in a world where survival hangs by a thread. Today we're diving into the brutal, gritty world of colonial maritime life during the age of exploration, especially focusing on the techniques they used to keep those mighty ships waterproof, sometimes with desperate, almost savage methods. This was an era when Europeans, driven by curiosity, greed, and faith, set out on voyages across uncharted oceans. Ships like caravels, naus, and galleons weren't just marvels of engineering for their time. They were floating worlds, filled with human stories of resilience, suffering, and courage. Building these ships was no small feat. They used 2,000 trees, mainly oak and cedar, selected for strength and flexibility. The wood was carefully shaped and layered, then fastened with iron nails. Crafting a seaworthy vessel meant sealing every inch tightly. Imagine the patience and skill it took to fit planks perfectly, with no modern sealants or adhesives. But sealing a ship wasn't just about craftsmanship. It was a brutal, ongoing battle against the relentless force of nature. The main enemy? Water seeping through the hull. Remember, these ships had to endure violent storms, pounding waves, and the constant caress of salty air that would erode their wood. To combat this, sailors employed some pretty crude yet effective techniques. They'd smear hot pitch, thick sticky tar over the hull, covering every crack and seam. Pitch was made from pine or other resinous trees, melted down into a boiling, bubbling mess that could burn your skin if you weren't careful. When applied hot, it seeped into the tiniest holes, hardening as it cooled. Sometimes they used a mix of tar and animal fats like whale blubber to make a more flexible seal. The process was messy, dangerous, and labor-intensive. Sailors would have to climb onto the wet, slippery decks with flaming torches or hot irons to melt the pitch, risking burns and accidents. The pitch coating wasn't perfect, mind you. It would crack or wear away over time, especially with constant salt exposure, so sailors had to reapply it on long voyages, sometimes every few weeks. Another brutal method? They'd pack cracks and seams with oakum, loose fiber made from old ropes soaked in tar and then unraveled. Pounding oakum into seams with mallets created an almost primitive plug, like stuffing a wound. It was a desperate manual fix that could hold for a while, but needed constant attention. Imagine the physical toll on those sailors, crawling along the wet hull, working in freezing rain, their fingers numb from cold, trying to shove in fibers that didn't want to stay. And if the ship was sinking or the leaks were too many, well, the crew had another savage trick, caulking with hemp or oakum, hammered into the seams with a mallet, then sealed with more pitch. This constant patchwork kept ships afloat, but the process was dangerous, dirty, and exhausting. They'd sometimes take hours working in cramped, wet conditions, all while trying to stay warm and alert, knowing a small mistake could mean death. Life aboard these ships was a whole other story. The hierarchy was strict, captains at the top, then officers, then the crew. A typical sailor's day started before dawn, working tirelessly, sailing, repairing, manning the sails in gales, or bailing out water. The conditions? Brutal, cold, damp, with the ever-present stench of salt, sweat, and rot. Food was often limited: hardtack, dried beans, salted meat, rations that could turn moldy or spoil. Malnutrition was common along with scurvy, which made teeth fall out and skin turn pale. Navigation, primitive by today's standards, they relied on basic instruments, compasses, astrolabes, and simple charts. Imagine trying to find your way through fog or storm with only a rough idea of where land might be. These sailors lived with the constant threat of shipwrecks. Storms could tear apart rigging, sink entire crews, or send ships crashing onto uncharted rocks. And the psychological toll? Unimaginable. Being trapped in a metal and wood cage, miles from land, with only the endless ocean surrounding you, must have felt like the brink of madness. Yet, despite all this, these sailors endured, through pain, cold, fear, and kept their ships floating. They developed techniques that seem primitive today but were essential for survival. The sealing methods, the constant patching, the relentless fight against the sea. These were the brutal techniques that kept their ships waterproof and afloat long enough to reach new worlds. It's a story of human ingenuity born from desperation, where every seam sealed and every patch worked, was a tiny victory over the vast, indifferent ocean. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a ship, the salty air biting into your skin, a cold wind slicing through your clothes. The smell of rotting wood mixes with the sharp tang of sea spray. Your hands are sweaty, slipping on the rough timber as you cling to the ropes. Your stomach twists, queasy, as the ship rolls on towering waves. It's loud, crashing, creaking, the shouts of sailors trying to steady the vessel. And inside, your mind races, knowing that beneath your feet, thousands of gallons of water threaten to seep in at every crevice, turning this floating prison into a death trap. Today we're going to explore how those brave, or maybe reckless, seafarers of the age of exploration kept their ships dry, fighting the relentless enemy, water itself. If you like stories about daring journeys, survival and human ingenuity against insurmountable odds, make sure to hit that like button. And if you want to dive deeper into maritime history, subscribe and activate that bell. Now let's set sail into the brutal, fascinating world of colonial shipbuilding and the brutal techniques used to keep these ships afloat. The Age of Discovery from the 15th to the 18th centuries was an era of giants, ships that stretched over 200 feet, built from thousands of oak and pine trees. These vessels carried crews of dozens to hundreds, crossing oceans that could swallow entire continents. Imagine the kind of courage it took, knowing that a single leak could spell disaster. Mortality rates on these voyages hovered around 20%, sometimes more, not just from storms or scurvy, but from the silent killer lurking in the hull, water. Now picture this. The ship hits a storm. The waves crash over the bow. Water floods the deck and seeps through the planks. Every creak of the timbers feels like a warning. The sailors scramble to bail out water, scoop it up with buckets, desperate to keep the ship from sinking. But how did they stop water from seeping in the first place? How did they turn a fragile boat into a seaworthy fortress? That's where their brutal, often primitive techniques come into play. Techniques that, surprisingly, are still part of maritime law today. Let's start with the most fundamental challenge, waterproofing the hull. You might think, well, they just sealed the seams and painted the wood. Not quite. The ships of that era were built using a technique called caulking. Imagine you're an 18th century sailor with a chisel, a mallet, and oakum, fibers made from old ropes. You'd remove planks from the hull, spread hot pitch or tar into the gaps, then hammer oakum into the seams. This process was brutal. The oakum was stuffed tight, then corked over with a layer of pitch to seal the water out. But it wasn't perfect. Over time, the natural expansion and contraction of wood combined with the salty sea air caused the seals to weaken. The crew had to constantly recork the hull, sometimes in the middle of a storm. Imagine the cold, the salt stinging your eyes. As you beat oakum into the cracks with a hammer, your fingers raw and bleeding. A failed seal meant water could get in, making the ship heavier, more sluggish, and, in the worst cases, sinking. And that's not all. The materials themselves were a brutal solution. Pitch and tar used to seal the wood were sticky, thick, and inflammable. They could be heated and poured into seams, but the process was dangerous. One spark and you had a fire on deck. The crew had to be careful, especially in rough seas, with the wind carrying sparks and the pitch simmering dangerously. But even with caulking and tar, water could still find its way in. So, the sailors invented more brutal measures, like ground tackle, where they'd reinforce the hull with extra planks or patch leaks with wool and moss stuffed into the cracks. Imagine the desperation. You're at sea, the ship's listing, water pouring in, and all you have are bits of moss, rags, and your own hands to plug the holes. It's primitive but effective, at least temporarily. Now let's talk about the interior. The ship's compartments, called holds, were often filled with ballast like stones or sand to stabilize the vessel. But this ballast also had its downsides. If water seeped in and mixed with the ballast, it could destabilize the ship, making it list or capsize. Plus, water in the hold was a breeding ground for mold, rot, and disease. The smell of damp wood, rotten food, and seasickness was constant. And don't forget the human element. Imagine the crew exhausted, their hands bleeding from endless caulking, their skin cracked and salt-scratched as they fought to stay alive. Many sailors suffered from shipwreck fever, a brutal combination of dehydration, scurvy, and the psychological toll of being trapped in a metal, wood, and salt prison. Often the water they managed to keep out was not just a threat but also a weapon. If it froze in the winter, it could crack the hull. If it evaporated in the heat, it left salt deposits that corroded the structure even more. But the sailors had yet another brutal trick up their sleeve: bilge pumping. The bilge was the lowest part of the ship, where water collected. They'd manually pump this water out using hand-operated pumps. Imagine the physical effort, swinging those wooden handles dozens of times, sweat pouring down your face, your back aching. The water could be ice cold, sharp as glass, prickling your skin. If they failed, the water would rise, and the ship would risk capsizing. Sometimes they'd have to remove hundreds of gallons of water. Up to 10% of the crew's effort was spent just keeping the bilge dry. And what about the sailors' tools? They used a mix of primitive but effective instruments: hand-tapped caulking irons, wooden mallets, pitch pots, and scrapers. All were designed to withstand the brutal conditions. The craftsmanship was remarkable, considering they had no modern adhesives or sealants. Every seam, every plank had to be meticulously maintained. Here's the shocking truth: these techniques kept ships afloat, but only just. The margin for error was razor-thin. A leak that went unnoticed overnight could grow into a breach that sank the entire vessel. And with sea storms, shifting cargo, and rotting wood, constant vigilance was essential. Imagine the psychological toll, knowing that at any moment, water could flood in, drowning you and your crew. The fear was real, the desperation palpable, but these sailors, tough as nails, did what they could. Patching, caulking, bailing, praying. It was a brutal, relentless fight against nature, and they knew that in the end, it was often luck that decided who lived and who perished. So, when you think about those grand ships crossing oceans, remember, behind the scenes was a constant, brutal battle against water. The colonists, explorers, and sailors relied on primitive yet relentless techniques. Brutal, yes, but effective enough to forge empires, discover new worlds, and change history. Every leak plugged, every seam caulked, was a small victory in a fight that could turn deadly in seconds, and this is just a glimpse of the brutal techniques used to keep those ships afloat. If you want to know exactly how they managed to make their ships nearly impermeable, how they fought the constant threat of flooding, there's a whole video right here on the channel. But for now, just imagine the pain, sweat, and courage it took to keep those floating prisons alive. Because in the end, maritime survival was a brutal game, and these sailors played it with everything they had. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a mighty wooden ship, the salty air biting into your skin. The sun blazes overhead, but you can feel the chill of fear lurking beneath every creak of the hull. Back then, keeping a ship afloat was an ongoing, brutal battle, one fought not just against the seas, but against the very wood and craftsmanship that held it together. Today, we take modern sealants, fiberglass, and steel for granted. But those sailors, they relied on crude tools, sweat, and sheer grit, and sometimes that just wasn't enough. Let's dive into what it really took to keep those ships from sinking in the age of colonization. Because behind every grand voyage across uncharted oceans was a relentless struggle, an unending fight against leaks, rot, and disaster. First, you'd think sealing a ship was simple, right? Just put some tar or pitch on the cracks. But in reality, it was a delicate art. The sailors used pitch pots, large clay vessels, heated over open fires to melt thick black tar. This tar was then brushed onto seams and cracks, sealing gaps, but it wasn't enough alone. The wood expanded and contracted with the weather. Hot sun, cold rain, salty sea. Spray, causing tiny fissures to open up again and again. To counter this, they added layers of oakum, fibrous material made from hemp or jute, stuffed into gaps, then covered with more tar. It was a sticky, messy business, with gobs of pitch dripping everywhere, and the smell of burning pitch filling the air. But here's the kicker. Even with these defenses, leaks could still sneak in, and in the harshest storms the ship would groan, shudder, and sometimes develop new breaches overnight. That's when the crew's ingenuity really shined. They'd patch with whatever they had, tar, rags, cloth scrapings, anything to slow the flood. Imagine a sailor's rough, calloused hands trembling from cold as he slathers hot pitch into a crack while seawater splashes over the deck. Every second counted. Now let's talk about a more insidious threat: rot and woodworm. Once water seeped in, the wood started to decay. In some cases, entire planks became soft and spongy, risking catastrophic failure. Here the sailors had a desperate trick. They'd drill holes into the rotten timber, then pour in a mixture of vinegar, salt, and resin, materials that acted as a primitive antifungal and preservative. Sometimes they'd even stuff the holes with dry oakum to absorb the moisture, hoping to buy a little more life for the ship's frame. But it wasn't just leaks and rot that haunted them. The sea was a cruel, unpredictable foe. Storms could batter a vessel for days, forcing water in through every tiny crack. The crew's bailing was relentless. Large buckets, wooden ladles, scooping out gallons of water every hour. The boat was a prison of floating. Martyr, imagine the pounding rain, the wind howling like a beast, the crew's muscles screaming as they fought to keep the water below the gunwales. And then there was the issue of cargo and ballast, shifting unpredictably. When the ship's interior became flooded, the uneven weight distribution caused corks and small planks to float free, adding to the chaos. The sailors would lash down cargo, but in storms everything shifted like a dance of death. A cargo box could turn into a dangerous projectile, smashing through weakened timbers or causing new leaks. But not everything was about fighting the water. Consider the crew's health. Long voyages meant limited medical supplies. Sailors often suffered from infections, bleeding gums, or broken teeth. Dental problems were common. Imagine a sailor's gums bleeding, his teeth loose from the salt and scurvy, enduring weeks or months at sea. If someone got an infection, sometimes they'd have to perform crude amputations with a rusty saw or cut out abscesses with a blade heated over fire. The pain was excruciating, and infection was often deadly. The constant exposure to dampness, coupled with poor hygiene, turned many sailors' lives into a slow march of suffering. Now, picture the psychological toll, the endless anticipation of leaks, the constant patching, the relentless bailing. Imagine how it wore on a man's mind. Think of Juan, a seasoned sailor, whose hands trembled from cold and fatigue. He'd been patching leaks since dawn, blood from a cut on his finger mixing with sweat and salt. Every creak of the ship sounded like a death knell. The fear that a tiny crack could turn into a breach, maybe during a storm, kept him awake at night. The ship was a fragile, living thing, and he was its desperate guardian. And yet, despite all these struggles, sailors developed ingenious, brutal techniques of survival. When woodworm threatened to devour the hull, some would apply a mixture of tar and lime, creating a barrier that was almost like a battlefield. When leaks appeared, they'd wedge wedges of wood or cork into the breach, then hammer them tight with mallets. These weren't perfect solutions, just enough to hold until better repairs could be made. Think about the materials they used. The ships were built from hundreds, sometimes thousands of oak planks, sometimes over 2,000 trees in one vessel. The craftsmanship was impressive, considering they lacked modern adhesives. Their caulking was a mix of oakum and pitch, hammered into seams with wooden mallets, held tight by the swelling of the wood, a natural if unreliable sealant. The crew's patience was tested daily, patching and repatching, knowing that one mistake could mean disaster. And all this effort was in service of a greater goal: exploration, colonization, empire building. These ships weren't just vessels, they were floating prisons, prisons that carried brave souls into the unknown, often to die far from home. Despite the brutality, they kept going, because the promise of new lands, wealth, or adventure was worth every ounce of suffering. Today we have steel hulls, synthetic sealants, and advanced engineering. But back then, it was sweat, blood, tar, and sheer willpower. Every leak plugged, every seam caulked was a small victory in a life-or-death game. The sailors knew they fought not just water, but the very limits of their craft and themselves. So next time you see a modern ship gliding smoothly across the ocean, think of the brutal, primitive techniques that kept those ancient vessels afloat. Think of the men who patched, bailed, and fought against the tide, men driven by hope, desperation, and a fierce desire to survive. Because in the age of colonization, maritime life was nothing short of a brutal, relentless war, a war against water, decay, and despair. And these sailors, with their rough hands and unbreakable spirit, fought it every single day. Imagine yourself aboard a massive wooden ship, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. The salty air bites into your skin, a constant reminder that you're at the mercy of nature. It's cold, it's loud, and every day feels like walking a tightrope over the abyss. That's life for sailors during the age of exploration, an unforgiving world of wood, water, and human grit. Back then, keeping these floating behemoths afloat was a daily battle. The hulls were packed with hundreds, sometimes over 2,000 oak planks, each one meticulously fitted, glued together with pitch and oakum, fibers from hemp or jute soaked in tar. But no matter how good the craftsmanship, leaks were inevitable. The ocean was a relentless enemy, and water always found a way in, and so every sailor knew what it meant to fight water with brute force. When a leak appeared, it was not just a small crack, it was a crisis. They'd wedge rough-hewn pieces of wood or cork into the breach, hammering them tight with mallets. But that was just a temporary fix, kind of like throwing a bandage on a severe wound. The real challenge was sealing those seams reliably, day after day. Imagine the scene. Men crawling along the splintered decks, their palms sore and blistered, fingers trembling from cold and fatigue. They'd toss in oakum fibers into the seams, then hammer them down with wooden mallets. The swelling of the wood soaked in pitch and tar would often seal the leak, sometimes. But sometimes the patch would fail overnight, and the water would start seeping again, cold and sharp as a blade slicing through silence. The crew's patience was tested every time they repaired a leak. Each patch was a small victory, but also a reminder of how fragile their vessel truly was. They'd often work in the dark, the only light flickering from lanterns, swinging wildly in the breeze. The smell of tar, salt, and wet wood filled the air, a cocktail of desperation and resilience. But it wasn't just water that threatened their lives. The ship was a prison on the water, cramped, noisy, and brutal. Think about the human toll. Crew members often suffered from hypothermia, their fingers frozen and numb, trying to hammer in patches in freezing rain. Gums bleeding, teeth falling out from scurvy, skin cracked and peeling. Some sailors would vomit over the side, seasick and exhausted, only to face more leaks, more repairs. It was a relentless cycle of suffering, and still, they kept going. Why? Because beyond the pain and despair lay hope, the hope of discovery, wealth, and home. These ships weren't just vessels, they were dreams afloat, fragile as the wood themselves. Every leak patched was a battle won in a war against the elements and despair. You could say these sailors were warriors, fighting not with swords but with tar and sweat. But here's the brutal truth. Life on these ships left scars on bodies and minds. Many sailors endured hardships so extreme that they emerged changed. Some became hardened, their souls carved from the salt and wood. Others broke under the weight of loneliness and fear. Imagine the mental toll, knowing that a small leak could turn into a disaster, that one mistake might mean death by drowning or starvation. And yet, they pressed on. They were driven by an unbreakable human spirit. They faced the cold, the storms, the pain. They fought to survive every day, pushing their bodies and minds beyond limits modern people can hardly imagine. The courage to patch a leak with trembling hands, to face a storm that could tear their ship apart, to stare into the abyss and keep sailing. That's what made these men heroes. Today we have steel hulls, synthetic sealants, and advanced engineering. A ship today can withstand storms that would have sunk their wooden ancestors. We're protected by technology, comfort, and safety. But let's not forget the price paid for that security. These sailors, those who patched and bailed, who fought water and despair, laid the groundwork for our modern world. Their sacrifices are the silent legacy behind every cruise, every cargo ship, every vessel that glides smoothly across the waves today. Their blood, sweat, and tears built empires, opened new worlds, and expanded human horizons. When you see a modern ship, think about the invisible battle fought by those anonymous sailors. Remember their courage, their resilience, because honestly, what they endured was anything but easy. Every leak they fought, every patch they hammered, was a testament to human endurance. They transformed fear into strength. Their resilience shaped history, one plank at a time. If you want to really appreciate how far we've come, just think about those primitive, brutal techniques. Imagine patching a leak with your bare hands, knowing that one slip could be your last. Today's sailors might complain about the weather or delays, but they don't face the brutal realities of tar-soaked wood and endless repair. And that's where the human story hits hardest. These sailors, the ones who slept with the salt crusted on their skin, who bled and trembled but refused to give up, these are the true heroes of the seas. Their sacrifices forged the pathways to new continents, new civilizations. Without their courage, none of us would be here enjoying the comfort of modern life. So next time you marvel at a sleek cruise liner or a modern cargo vessel, take a moment. Think about the primitive, brutal techniques that kept those ancient ships afloat. Remember the men who patched and fought water every day, risking everything for exploration and empire. Their stories are woven into the fabric of history. Stories of resilience, human grit, and unbreakable spirit. And if you're fascinated, you should check out the details of these techniques, how they worked, what tools they used, and the kind of courage it took to patch a ship in the middle of the ocean, because understanding these stories isn't just about ships or technical know-how. It's about recognizing the incredible resilience of human nature, how ordinary men faced extraordinary challenges and refused to surrender. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey. If you enjoyed this story of maritime heroism, drop a like, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and stay tuned for the next episode. Because these stories remind us, no matter how tough life gets, the human spirit can rise, endure, and transform adversity into a legacy that lasts centuries. That's the true voyage, one of resilience, courage, and hope.